No discussion today of the economy can begin without a discussion of what's happening in Washington, D.C. And I'm referring, of course, to the national debt and the deficit problems that we have. It appears that this is the issue of our times today, and a major source of discussion in Washington, D.C., but just about anywhere else. It seemed like the Great Society of the 60s has come face to face with the Tea Party today. And there's the debate of ideas, the debate of policies, and the discussions are important because the stakes are so high. For the United States only, not only for the United States, but also for the world as a whole. Because over the last several decades, in fact, we have gotten used to government doing a lot of things for us. Whether you're in the middle class, whether you're in the top bracket, whether you're in the bottom, government has done a lot of things for each and every one of us. But that old model may be becoming out of date. And we all love the big government. We all love the things that the government does for us, whether it's mortgage deduction that we get, whether it's Medicaid or Medicare, or whether the tax credit that you may get at upper income level, at all tiers. But maybe that model, that old car, clunker, needs to be traded in for something leaner, something more efficient, with high efficiency that gives us better performance. I'm sure you all heard the news of the rating being lowered for the United States debt, not the rating being lowered, but the outlook being lowered for the rating. S&P just this week, if you haven't heard, lowered the outlook for U.S. debt to negative from stable. That's a major warning shot for the politicians in Washington, D.C., but just and around the world, that U.S. debt situation cannot continue, deficit situation cannot continue the way it has been. The national debt has a ceiling of $14.2 trillion or thereabout. And ceilings have been increased over time. And this ceiling is going to be exceeded in the next 2 to 3 months. The estimates vary. It could be in June, it could be July, sometime early July. And that means that government cannot make the payments on the debt it has if that ceiling is not raised. Currently, the Republican Party has taken the position that we are not going to vote for the ceiling increase unless there's an agreement on the deficit plan for the government. Now, in some sense, the ceiling is really an artifact. It's sort of artificial. Let me give you an example. Say we all borrow money, and you say, well, I'm going to put a limit on how much debt I'm going to have. Let's say $100,000. That's my limit. I'm not going to have any more debt, no matter what kind. But on the other hand, you keep spending, you keep using your credit card on a daily basis, and on a monthly basis, you're spending more than you bring in. Sooner or later, you're going to have a debt that's going to exceed $100,000, the limit that you set. And you can say, well, I'm not going to raise the limit. Well, if you're not going to raise the limit, the debtors are going to come after you if you don't make the payments. So the solution is not to do, you have to raise the debt ceiling anyway. The solution is reducing your credit card charges. You've got to start spending less and bring your income and expenditure in balance with each other. Very simply put, that's the situation that we have with the federal debt and deficit. Our annual deficit is about $1,400 billion for this year. Deficit. Now, in terms of percentage of GDP, which will be equivalent to a percentage of our income, federal government spending is about 25% of GDP. Federal revenues are about 16%. So there's about 9% gap between spending and revenues at the federal level. Now, as you also may have heard, this is the statement that S&P issued. And I thought I'll put it down because this is a very strong statement. More than 2 years after the beginning of the recent crisis, US policymakers have still not agreed on how to reverse recent fiscal deterioration or address longer-term fiscal pressures. And they say there's a material risk that within the next 2 years, federal government debt's rating will be reduced from AAA rating that it has currently. Now, it may be a political move. Some people say, S&P didn't have to do that. But it's an important action that S&P have taken. And that means that usually they take this action when there is at least 1/3 of a chance that such lowering of the rating will actually take place within the next 2 years. We know that we have two competing plans now available to us to look at. One is Representative Ryan's plan, and the other is President Obama's plan. Both plan to reduce deficit by $4 to $4.5 trillion over the next 10 or 12 years, depending on which plan you look at. Let me just give you a quick review, first of all, of the approach between the two. The amount may be that is very similar, $4.5 billion. But the way they reach this reduction is very, very different. Representative Ryan has a plan, for example, Medicare, which will completely turn the Medicare around, a different system. He will make other drastic cuts on many of the programs of the federal government, while President Obama's approach is more gradual, more consensus building, make marginal changes in Medicare and other programs, and raise taxes, whether they are tax rates or whether they are the elimination of tax expenditures. One way or the other, President Obama has a lot of emphasis put on the tax increases. Here's a very brief review of the comparison between the two, though I'm sure you've seen it, but maybe not that kind of detail. The first column is the budget that President Obama presented in February when Republicans hadn't presented their plan, which does almost nothing to the federal debt. The number there are percentages of GDP. As I mentioned earlier, expenditures are 25% of GDP. So what we're talking about here is, for example, Representative Ryan's plan will reduce that percentage from 25% of the GDP to 21.5%. And President Obama's will reduce it a little bit less than that. So this is how you should interpret the numbers. As you can see, that President Obama's plan will increase taxes by 1.9% tax revenue, 1.9% of GDP, while there's only a small increase planned in Representative Ryan's plan. There's a much larger increase in discretionary spending in the congressional plan, and healthcare in particular, 1.3%, while there is a much smaller increase. So there are major differences in the way they're going to go about it, but it's going to make a big difference in the lives of many people, if not all of us, which plan is passed. The reason it is important to pay attention to what happens is it's going to have major consequences for the economic growth of the country. What happens to taxes, for example? What happens to health care coverage? What happens to other discretionary spending is going to have a major impact on employment and growth in various sectors. I don't have to tell you that Washington doesn't move very quickly, not very easily. And I'm sure they will find a way to go only halfway and have the debt ceiling lifted so that they can make the payments. And the discussion will probably continue beyond that. The danger is that if not enough is done, the bond market may not like that, not only domestically but internationally. As we all know, China holds a lot of our debt. So does Japan and many other countries. Unless we reassure them that we are not going to default and that we have the ability to pay and we intend to make payments on our debt and maintain the standing, it can damage the reputation and the economic progress for the country. The second point I want to mention before I talk about the recovery domestically is how the world has changed so much in the last several years. We've been talking about globalization, how we rely so much on the rest of the world, but three episodes in the recent past clearly bring home the message that the U.S. is not in that kind of dominant position that we have been since the Second World War. This is a different world. So if we want to maintain our leadership going forward, we have to operate differently. We have to view our rivals or our competitors differently, and we have to take perhaps a much more interactive approach, more aggressive approach, working with other countries and competing with them than what we have done in the past. Isolationist policies are not the way to go in the future. Global financial crisis may have started in the US, but it spread throughout the world, showing the interconnection, the financial connection that the world has with each other. What's happening in Portugal, what may happen in Spain, or what happened in Greece affects not only European Union, but the rest of the world as well. The Japanese crisis, twin crisis or triple crisis actually, if you look at the floods as well, disrupted supply chains throughout the world. US auto companies shut down because of tsunami and the nuclear disaster in Japan. And it's going to have recurring consequences for several years until Japan recovers from that. And the Middle East turmoil. Again, may have started in a local area, but its impact through oil prices and political impacts are felt throughout the world. So U.S. policy going forward has to be cast and thought about in a very different way. We individually, as we operate our businesses or think about it, we have to have a global attitude in the way we think about it, the way we make our business decisions, and implications of what is happening abroad. We have to be a lot more alert to what's happening abroad, politically, in politics, in economics, in social ways, so that we can interpret and we can see how to relate to that and react to that. Let me, well, oil prices I just mentioned, the Middle East. Oil prices have sharply increased since the crisis in the Middle East. It's partly also because the economy has been recovering. And things could get worse if Middle East crisis spreads. If Saudi Arabia comes under pressure, then all bets are off. But our hope is that oil prices will not go up sky high, that they will stay in the moderate range of $100, $110 or $20 at most. But that is putting a strain on the recovery, U.S. recovery, because oil prices are so ingrained in the growth of the economy. We are so dependent on oil prices, though at current levels, high prices, $110 or so, which is our assumption, by the way, baseline assumption, economy will be affected only slightly. Let me now turn to a formal discussion of the U.S. economy, what's happening, what has happened recently, where we are, and where we are headed. As you can tell by reading the newspapers, I'm sure you all pay attention to that, employment situation has started to get better. U.S. economy has started to add jobs. This is a graph of the payroll jobs. Last month, U.S. economy added 200,000 jobs, which was one of the highest numbers that it has posted in several years. It is not enough. It's a very good start. It's a great improvement from where we were. We expect that growth in job creation to continue, and it needs to continue for a sustained recovery. Initial jobless claims have fallen sharply, indicating that employers are not laying off as many people as they did before. They are starting to look forward to growth. But one of the most serious problems of the recent recession and unemployment that was caused by that are the number of people who have been unemployed for a long time. This is the number of people on the right side, you see, who have been unemployed for more than 6 months. That's 6 million people, 600, this is in thousands. 6 million people who have been unemployed for over 6 months. Not only do they lose money, and government has to pay the unemployment benefits, but they lose skills. They're out of the market, and the market's always changing. Job picture is always changing. If they are not staying on the job and continuing to improve their skill, there's a danger that their skill will be out of date. It'll be much harder to get them back in the job market. And it's especially true for people who are in disadvantaged circumstances to begin with. Minorities, young people, And for them, it's going to be much harder to get back in the marketplace. And we'll give you a lot more information. Mira is going to get into the details of this. Unemployment rate has started to come down. It reached over 10%, and for the last month it was 9.2%, which is again a good sign. But don't expect the unemployment rate to drop very sharply over the next 2 years. Because as job picture improves, a lot of people who had dropped out of the job market, who were not searching for jobs, they're going to jump back in. And so even though jobs are being created, unemployment rate may still high. Consumer confidence has improved as well over the last several months. It's not quite as high as it was several years ago before the financial crisis. But it may take a little while yet because of all the other issues that are on the horizon that are on the mind of the consumer. But households are feeling better. Stock market has recovered substantially. It dropped from 14,000 to about 6,600 in the middle of the financial crisis. It has gone back up to about 12,000. Somebody asked me what's going to be at the end of the month, end of the year. I think it was Evo. We don't forecast stock market, but I think the economy is going to be certainly better by the end of the year, and hopefully stock market will be too. Household net worth took a big hit in the last recession. It dropped from about $63 trillion. This is the value of housing, all assets that households own. It dropped by about $12 trillion. It has recovered more than halfway, but there is still a long way to go. Housing prices still stay down, which is a major source of wealth for individuals. So until there's a recovery in housing market, and we'll talk more about that, at this level may stay depressed. Savings rate has improved somewhat, as you probably remember from our discussions 2 or 3 years ago during the Great Recession. Households were saving almost nothing. In fact, they were borrowing more than than their income, and there's a negative saving rate for many years. So as a result of this crisis, saving rate is slightly up. The deleveraging, which is reducing your personal debt, there was a sharp deleveraging after the financial crisis, and had to happen. It'll continue for some time, but it seems to have stabilized for the moment because the economy has started to recover, and households have paid off a lot of their debt, recurring debt at least. GDP has started to improve, which is the clear sign of end of the recession. I know the economists take a little while before they know whether the recession is over or not, but I think that they have finally figured out the recession is over, at least in terms of GDP growth. GDP increased by 3.1% in the last quarter, and 2.9, I think before that, the green bars on the right-hand side. We think GDP growth rate is going to continue to improve, but it's not going to be a dramatic improvement as we have seen in previous recessions. This recession was very, very deep, and Mira is going to talk about how bad it was. Getting out of that has been very difficult. It's going to be a slow process. A lot of structural changes have taken place, both within our country and around the world. And so going forward over the next several years, we're going to be in a completely unknown territory. It's a different world that we're dealing with. So we have to come up with new ways of growth, new ways of employment, and that will determine how fast the GDP grows. So the future is not as certain as it has been in the previous recessions. You go down, come back up. It's not that kind of a recession this time. So we'll spend some more time discussing it, but I'm going to invite Mira here to take you through the details of the macroeconomy, different variables, and how they're moving along. Come on up here. And I'll come back and talk about Southern California and Orange County.
Thank you, Anil, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, the good news is that there's finally some good news, and then Anil sort of set the stage a little bit. Some recent data has improved. We actually got some good news in terms of employment. We've gotten a few good news about real GDP. Production has improved. But we've kind of been here before. I mean, we've actually seen these numbers improve in the past. And the question now is, I mean, is the recovery finally here, or are we up for some more disappointment? And in fact, this sort of reminds me of a remark by Churchill, and I promise this will be my last one from him, because I know I mentioned it a year ago. But it sort of reminds me of a remark by Winston Churchill, which he made in a dinner party he was attending a while back, and it was actually addressed to the hostess of the party. It's not very flattering, but as most of his comments were, but it went something along the lines of, well, miss, with all due respect, I'm quite drunk right now, but in the morning I'll be sober and you'll still be ugly. So the question is, when we wake up, is this recovery going to look for real, or is it going to look ugly in the morning? And that's what we're actually going to try to sort of bring in front of you today. So with that in mind, let me just go over the main themes. What am I going to cover here today? Well, first up, it's kind of with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of having a little bit of more data available. Is this last decade that we just went through, is that going to be the lost decade for us? Then we'll take a closer look at, well, now that the recession is kind of over, we kind of feel that. Are we actually back? And here, true to sort of my profession as an economist, I'll give you an answer, on the one hand, yes, on the other hand, no. So we'll take a look whether we're back from recession. And lastly, I'll just take a look at the recovery outlook. I mean, how is it going to shape up going forward? And here, in a nutshell, let me just say, kind of getting out of the way here, let me just say that the recovery outlook is much, much brighter, but there's going to be some risks, and that's what we're going to lay out for you. So is this the lost decade for us? Is the last decade something that we should forget? And this was the Time magazine did call it the decade from hell. Is this shaping out to be a decade from hell? Well, let's take a look at a couple of main indicators. Well, first up, let's look at employment. If you see here, employment levels right now are at exactly the same level as they were back in 2000. Problem with that is that we've added about 30 million people in the meantime. So this is quite a worrisome picture. So again, in terms of employment, the name kind of bears it out. This may be the decade from hell. Same story kind of appears when we deal with real estate, when you look at real estate prices. And these kind of shows real estate prices both in terms of commercial and housing. Well, in both markets, prices are now back to where they were early in the decade. So it's kind of shaping up. It's sort of fair to think and to say that this decade may actually be sort of the lost decade for us, and hopefully the next one, the one we're in, will actually be a better one. Coincidentally, this was the decade that I graduated, got a job, bought a house. It's just talk about perfect timing. I mean, I know how to pick them. So, but the reason why this is sort of maybe perhaps this is the lost decade. Maybe this is something we probably should forget, and with the next one we should feel more optimistic about, is because the recession that we just went through pretty much wiped out every gain that was made in the middle of that decade. So a natural question that would follow is, well, are we back yet? I mean, have we gained anything? Have we gained any grounds, if at all, from the recession? And first, the good news, and this picture this graph sort of bears that out. Well, the GDP right now is back to the pre-crisis level. In fact, the latest number as of December 2010, GDP surpassed by just a little bit the level that it reached back in 2007. Problem is, and again, so the good news is we're back. The problem is that we're around 7.5% below where we could have been had the crisis never happened. So again, some good news and a little bit bad news here. Same story goes for consumption spending. I mean, consumption spending fell about 2.4% during the crisis. This is pretty much the biggest drop we've ever seen since World War II. I mean, and you're going to hear me say about, this is probably the worst since World War II. The good news is we're back. In fact, we've recovered all the levels. We got back everything we lost during this recession as of December of 2010, the latest data available. Issue is, again, even here, we're quite below trend, about 7% below crisis levels. Now, a complete opposite picture shows up in residential investment. This is pretty much residential consumption. And the story here is that not only are we not back, we're actually at the lowest level, and this picture shows this graph only shows compared to the last decade. But in fact, if you look at the entire history, going back to the 1950s, when the record began, residential construction is at its lowest level. And the issue is that it's not only at the lowest level, it's basically there's no sign of imminent recovery anytime soon, at least not in this market. This is not a surprise, and the reason being is obviously, as we all know and we felt it in our gut, is that this recession was quite deep because it was accompanied by a terrifying housing crash. But how does this recovery sort of measure up to other recoveries? Again, we sort of feel it. This has been painfully slow, excruciatingly weak. It has been a very, very long slog. This table sort of calculates and compares other post-war recoveries with the current one, and the last column gives the difference in growth rates in these. So the calculations are made as follows. So I looked at the trough of the recession, 6 quarters out. That's where we are right now, a year and a half out into the recovery. So this current recovery, in fact, in terms of growth rates, it's a lot weaker, and it's below in every single component. You look at real GDP, we look at consumption, we look at residential investment, look at employment, look at income. It scores lower in every single category in terms of the strength of the recovery, except for one. And the only one is basically profits. Right now, corporate profits are about 37.4% higher from the trough of the recession compared to an average of 24.5% in the previous recoveries. So that's the only positive sort of component compared to the others. But how does the recovery outlook, how is it shaping up to be? I mean, what do we expect this to be? Well, but the good news is that it's much, much improved. It's a lot brighter. In fact, we believe the recovery will gain strength, will gain breadth during this current year, but there'll be some risks and some clouds and turbulence. And I don't know why it sounds a lot more melodramatic saying it. It sounded better when I wrote it than now that I'm saying out loud. But keeping it with a sort of a weather forecast, the melodrama, let's take a look at the factors that are sort of shaping up this current recovery. Let's start with the bright. And here we have all the factors that basically have supported the recovery up to now and will continue to do so in the future. In fact, in the current year and in 2012. And here we have corporate profits, which is what I mentioned, business investment, production, exports, inventories. This list is getting longer and longer, which is good news. This is actually pretty good news. Next, let's take a look at the cloudy. And these are factors that basically have improved. They have recovered quite a bit. But because of the devastating impact of the recession, it will take them quite a bit longer to get back to their normal levels. And here we have the labor market, consumption, and the banking sector. And lastly, let's look at the turbulent. And here we have those factors that will be absolute drags in the recovery. And we have housing and, of course, the government sector, both the federal and at the state and local level. So I'll take a very quick look at some of these factors, starting with the bright. Well, I mean, we've talked about this for a couple of months in a row. I've talked about this, but corporate profits are up. In fact, they've recovered. They're actually setting brand new records. Corporations are sort of sitting in around $1.6 to $1.8 trillion of cash, depending on how you look at it. It's about 6 to 7% of their total assets. So this is good news. So corporate profits are looking very good. Business investment has also rebounded very sharply. In fact, this component of real GDP was the first one to come back early in the recovery cycle, and it's continued to be very strong. Right now, if we pay attention at the year-over-year changes, right now it's running at the highest rate, even compared to the tech boom of the 1990s. So this is really good news. In fact, going forward, we expect this components of business investment in equipment and software to continue to strengthen this year and the next. So this will hold up pretty well. Well, let's look at the cloudy. I mean, again, these are those things that have improved, but they're not there yet, and will take quite a lot longer for them to get to the normal level. And I'll spend a little bit more time in these, and of course, the worst factors as well. Let's start up with the labor market. Well, the labor market has improved dramatically. The private sector has added jobs for 13 straight months, starting with March of last year. This graph shows the improvement in payroll in the private sector. This is not total non-farm payroll. This is just the private sector. As you can see, in fact, if you count from March 2010 till now, they've added on about 1.8 million jobs. And even better news is that the pace of job formation has actually picked up quite substantially the last couple of months, as Anil mentioned. In February, we added about 230,000 jobs. In March, we added another 240,000 jobs. So this is actually pretty good news. The problem is, and as we've sort of mentioned it again and again, the problem is that what was lost during the recession was quite substantial. We lost 8.7 million jobs during this recession. Keeping in mind that the labor force expands naturally about 120,000 jobs per month, it will take quite a long time, basically, for the labor market to go back to normal. It will take quite a long time for the labor market to soak up all the unemployed, all the jobs that were destroyed during the recession, plus the natural expansion of the labor force. So the next sort of natural question is, well, how long will it take for the labor market to get back to normal? I mean, this is actually a crucial question. The answer is depends. It depends on how many jobs we add per month. And we ran actually a few calculations here. You know, what if we added about 100,000 jobs per month? 120,000. Well, we'll never get back to normal. We'll never get back to normal. Pretty much we'll be treading water. We'll never get back to normal because it takes about 120,000 just to keep up with the natural expansion of the labor force. What about if we had 200,000, which is what we've been doing lately? What happens if we actually add 200,000 jobs? Well, it'll take about upward 7 years for us to get back to normal. Let's assume a more optimistic scenario, 400,000 jobs, and this is 400,000 jobs per month from here on out. Even then, it will take 2 full years for us to get back to normal. So, in fact, 2.1 years. So it's quite a long time for the labor market to recover. So this is one of the weakest spots that we have to deal with. I guess not the best time to run for any re-elections, but more power to those who do. I admire you guys. So, same story kind of appears in consumption spending. Consumption spending has picked up quite robustly. In fact, over the last quarter of 2010 and early in 2011, it picked up quite robustly. Right now, it's running at the highest rate it ever did, even in the heydays of 2000. Of course, what helped here was that the tax deal of late December, with a payroll deduction of 2% plus the extension of tax cuts, that helped quite a bit. The flip side is that some of these benefits will probably be partially offset due to higher gas prices, as well as some potential tax hikes at the state and local level. So this is something we have to be careful about. Going forward, we do think that consumption spending will strengthen this year, running at slightly lower clip than it did late in 2010 and early in 2011, but still quite strong. So this will be a help. This will actually help the recovery going forward. The slightly bigger structural issue we have a slightly bigger problem with spending, and this graph sort of captures that. This graph shows spending as % of disposable income. This is more of an issue medium term to long term. As you can see here, we've slowly edged up. Consumption spending makes up more and more of a % of disposable income. In the 70s and 80s, it made up about 77%. In 80s and early 90s, it made up about 80%. In the heydays of last decade, 84%. After, it's kind of edged down a little bit. It's at around 83% right now, but it's still quite high, so it's still quite unsustainable. So we have a little bit of issue, not so much with the consumption in the long term, but longer term. We'll probably see structural issues with consumption sort of have a negative impact on growth in the longer term. Well, the banking sector is also has been doing very well, depending on how you look at it. Banks' profitability actually has recovered quite a bit. It's gone up. Bank profits have soared, obviously supported largely by a rebound in the financial sector and by huge government support. Problem with it is that, again, bank charge-off rates are quite high. And the reason why, obviously, is because banks still are sitting around with a bunch of bad loans in their assets, in their balance sheets. If you see here, this actually shows the ratio of charge-off, the charge-off rates. Historical average is quite low. Right now, even though the current data it's moving in the right direction, so the charge-off rates is actually going down, it's quite high compared to the historical average. And unless this ratio becomes more manageable, in other words, edges closer to the historical average, we don't see the banking sector add substantially to economic activity, at least not in the near term. So again, these are factors that we need to kind of think about. They've improved, but quite some more improvement are needed in this sector as well. Well, what about the turbulent? What about those risk factors that are absolutely drags on the recovery? And here, of course, the usual suspects are the housing market and the government sector. Well, first up, the housing market. I mean, the housing market has faced persistent issues. It actually staged a small recovery, a modest recovery from mid-2009, mid-2010, but that was actually reversed later in 2010 and even now. In fact, if you take a look at the recent data, the house prices on an annual level are now about 2% below where they were about a year ago. In fact, housing activity is pretty frightening, it's pretty dismal. As you can see, it's at the lowest level it ever was compared to the 50s, even going all the way back to the 50s. And again, the problem is that population is that much more. It has increased quite substantially during this time. Our forecast has it that so we expect the housing market to basically shed another 4 to 5% during 2011, flatten out in 2012, and then stage a recovery in 2013 and onwards. So that's again a bit grim here. As Anil mentioned, and I'll just go over it very quickly, I thought this chart may actually put things more in perspective. The budget deficit is in shambles. I mean, this is an absolute frightening picture. In fact, this picture makes it even more acute. This graph shows more acutely the issues that we're facing. It actually shows the budget deficit as percent of GDP for main economies, for advanced economies. And if you can see, and this is the latest data as of 2010, the U.S. budget deficit, as Anil mentioned, is about 9.2% of GDP. This is far, far worse than any European nation, far worse than Japan, far worse than Canada. And what's actually more worrisome to me is that, I can no longer pick on Europe anymore about the government excesses. We're actually doing pretty bad ourselves. I mean, that's one of the concerns that we have. Now, going forward, some reform is necessary. And in fact, reform will actually have to deal with the three legs of the stool, dealing with this cutting spending, drastic cutting spending, tax reform, as well as entitlement reform. So all three are necessary. But however you slice it and dice it, I mean, however you look at these things, clearly the government sector will be more of a drag in the near term and in the long term. Until all this reform takes effect, this will be an absolute drag on economic growth going forward. And it must, in a sense. We need to confront these issues. We need to basically get the budget deficit under control. State and local governments are also in a terrible shape. In fact, this picture is kind of going the wrong direction. It shows the employment at the state and local level. Obviously, state and local government have been firing people. It's exactly the opposite of what we saw in the private sector. Their budget deficits need to be tackled. Not only that, but if you look at the national level, states and local government are basically facing around $3 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Primarily, this is in public pensions. As someone who draws a check from the government, I guess my pension is an unfunded liability as well. So I'll be doing this till I'm 80. So good luck. We'll be stuck. So where does this leave us? And again, just what I sort of wanted to give you here is sort of a bird's eye view on where we are, what is helping the recovery. Well, a bigger list. The bright has actually grown. So this is the good news. The cloudy, these are stuff that has improved, will continue to improve, so they should help the recovery going forward. And then we have the turbulent. We have a few things that will absolutely drag the recovery. Overall, the picture is much more improved. And in fact, I've been wanting to show you this next slide for about 3 years now, but now it's the time. So I leave you with a better note. So hope at last. This is actually more optimistic. I do find that it's always good to be optimistic. It's no use of being anything else. So at least this is actually an improvement. And with that in mind, on that positive note, I'll turn it over to Anil for the forecast, and I'll meet you here for more questions. Thank you.
How many of you feel a little depressed? Not Mira's fault. Mira has gone through a very detailed analysis of the macroeconomy. And actually the way to think about this is don't look at the past. It's terrible. Don't look at the past. Look at the future. Look at things that have started to improve. Business investment, consumption, employment gains, profitability for businesses, even housing. In each of these areas, at least in the last 6 months or so, there has been perceptible improvement. And going forward, our view is that this growth is going to continue and become stronger, in fact. I think that's the message that Mira wanted to convey, but of course you have to talk about the history, which looks terrible. 2 things I want to add to the macro part before we move on to Orange County. Inflation and interest rates. I know both things are very, very important to a lot of decisions that you make in your daily life, in your businesses. Our view is that interest rates are ready to rise for various reasons. One of the most important ones is that the Federal Reserve Bank's QE2, the quantitative expansion of money supply, is going to end at the end of June. Now people talk about QE3, but I doubt that that's going to happen for various reasons. Federal Reserve Bank may not start to withdraw liquidity right away. It may wait 6 months or even a year, but it's not going to add more to that. At the same time, the economy is becoming stronger, which is going to increase the demand for credit, though there's plenty of liquidity around, both in the private sector and the public. So rates will not rise substantially, but they are on their way up. I know maybe my banker friends feel differently. In a way, it's good for them in some ways. Inflation. Now, when you get inflation numbers every month, they tell you this is the basic inflation rate, but if you take energy and food, volatile, there is no inflation. And my wife always tells, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Every time I go to the grocery store, I have to pay more. And you keep saying there is no inflation. Well, it's true that there is real inflation out there when you look at the comprehensive measure of inflation that affects all of us when you go out. But from the policy point of view, when Federal Reserve Bank gets concerned about inflation and takes an action to contain inflation, they look at the fundamental inflation that is tied to wage inflation, labor costs, and materials costs. When that starts going up, that is real inflation to them, and they have to take certain action. Looking at the economy today, with 8 million people with no jobs, and more people being added to the labor force, and even at the highest job creation rate that we can imagine, 200,000 or 300,000 jobs a year, it's going to be several years before that labor force is going to be absorbed. There's little chance that wages are going to shoot up substantially over the next 2 to 3 years. Now, with materials costs, commodity prices have been going up because China is on a spending spree, but they are also having inflationary problem and they're cutting back. India has substantial inflationary problem. So the world economy is growing, but there is also concern about inflation. So our forecast for inflation, and let me show you our forecast, macro forecast, is for about 2.5% inflation this year and 2.8% next year. Our GDP forecast for this year is about 3% and 3.1% next year. And you might wonder, isn't this a little low for GDP? Yes. Post-recession GDP growth rates are usually much higher, at least for a short while, 4 or 5%. And there may be quarters where you might see 4 to 5% increase. But we continue to think that growth in GDP for various reasons, is going to continue to be moderate, continue to be in the 3.5%, 3.25% range rather than 4 to 5% range on an ongoing basis. Government policies, some of the reasons. World situation that's going on is another reason. But there is no question that we are growing, the world economy as a whole is growing, and that trend will continue unless something unforeseen, completely unforeseen happens. Unemployment rate, we expect it to drop to 8.8% this year from 9.6. This is the average for the year, and 8.3. Only a small decline in the unemployment rate. We will not get to the 6% or 5% unemployment rate, which now may be the new full employment rate, for several years yet. What about Orange County? What's happening in our backyard, and given the macro picture, how does that affect us? But let's take a look at some numbers. Again, we have to look at the past, believe it or like it or not. Huge losses, job losses in Orange County. These are monthly losses. Normally, average rate of job creation in Orange County, with a base of about 1.4 million total jobs, it's about 25,000 jobs per year that we add. We were losing jobs at the rate of 128,000 a month in the most severest part of this recession. In the last 2 quarters, end of the 2010, the first quarter of this year, county has slowly started to add jobs, net jobs. But on an annual basis, we lost 109,000 jobs in 2009, and we lost another 19,000 jobs last year in 2010. Compare that to the previous growth. The highest growth we've had in the last 20 years was 65,000 jobs in 1 year at the most explosive rate of growth. So again, the story that we told in the national level, that it's going to be several years before we get back to the total employment level that we had, that also holds for Orange County. What have our different major sectors in the economy done? What we did was peg them at 100 for January 09, and we are plotting 4 major sectors. Construction, which is the lowest line. It's not hard to see why that is so. Leisure and hospitality, high tech is the blue line, and then professional and business services, one of the major sectors in the county. None of the lines at this time is above 100, which means the employment level has not changed in the last 2 years. There have been no net gains in any of these sectors. In fact, construction sector is substantially below, about 15% or 20% below its level of 2 years. Construction sector in this recession lost about 1/3 of its payroll employment, and it's going to be a while before. High-tech sector has started to get better. Manufacturing nationally has improved, and somebody asked me, why isn't manufacturing doing better in Orange County? Well, nationally there's a lot of heavy-duty manufacturing, cars, other kind of heavy, and that sector has recovered very well. High-tech sector never lost too many jobs, but they're starting to recover slowly. IBM came out with the earnings today, very impressive earnings, and high-tech sector is likely to pick up speed, and we will benefit from that. The rate of unemployment in Orange County is about 9.1% now. Finally, we are under the national level. We have, this is very unusual for Orange counties to have such high unemployment rates. Our normal unemployment rate is about 4%. We have had that for the last 20 years. So we are twice the rate, and again, it will not drop very quickly. It will take a little time. Housing, we all want to know what's happening and where we're headed. We took a big drop from 700, this is the California Association of Realtors number, but it doesn't matter, Data Quick or this one, the relative decline is about the same. Orange County homes lost about 40% of their value and went back up over 500,000, 550,000, but the latest number for the last month is about just under 500,000. Median home price for an existing single-family home is, you can look at new homes, which is different. This is for existing homes. We have some home builders here. They know the distinction very well. Pardon me? They're cheaper. Yes, new homes are a lot more expensive, but there are not too many new homes being built right now. There are a few, but not too many. Housing sector nationally, we saw the same story. A recovery of housing prices by about 20%, but then in the last several months, they have come down again. There are a lot of reasons. Foreclosures is one of the major reasons. There's a huge overhang that banks are holding on to. There are different stages of foreclosure default, and that is hanging out there, and there are problems with processing, as we all know. Unless those problems are resolved, the housing market will continue to suffer from lack of activity, and therefore housing prices are going to stay subdued. Our forecast is that for Orange County, the average housing price will increase less than 5% for the year, this year. 6 months ago, we had the same forecast, and we have no reason to change it, really. The first 3 months have been, we have seen decline actually in housing prices. At that time, a lot of people said, oh, housing prices in Orange County are going to go up 15, 20%. We don't see that. I think it's going to be a little while before we see that kind of increase. Construction have to start, new housing have to pick up. A lot of other things have to happen before you'll see an increase in housing prices. Permits, building permits dropped sharply during this recession, as we all know. We expect them to go up in the coming year. This is our forecast for 2011. For the region, Southern California region as a whole, there are more problems because Inland Empire was hit the worst, and they have a much longer way to go. So the average for Southern California is going to be much lower. The improvement is going to be much slower. Finally, to give you the employment forecast for the county, EDD data, official data, it comes only once a month. It's revised constantly. So we have our own survey that we do. Many of you participate in that. If you don't, we'll invite you to do that. It's once a quarter. And we ask the business executives, what do you think is happening in your industry? What do you think is happening nationally? How do you see the picture in the coming quarter on a number of different areas? And we construct a variable called OCBX index, overall index of expectations. And we plot that against the employment growth for the county. And it turns out that that's a very good leading indicator. What happens to the index predicts employment changes by 2 quarters, by at least 2 quarters. As you can see, the blue line is the index and the red line is the percentage employment change year over year. And that has led the employment change both in ups and downs. Based on all the data analysis that we can do, our forecast is that for this year, Orange County will gain about 19,000 jobs as a whole for about 1.4% gain. Next year, that will increase to about 31,000 jobs for 2.2% increase. Unemployment rate will drop from 9.6 to 8.6 and then to 7%, but still say much higher than anybody would like to see. This is sort of a summary of our forecast for Orange County and nation as a whole. It is an optimistic scenario, though it's hard to believe sometimes. As I said, don't look back. Let's start looking forward. This is the time to start looking forward. What are the things that we can do to create jobs, to strengthen our financial system at the national level and the state level? Let's do something at the state level. Something. Let's not just sit there not doing anything, because that is not a solution. That's a recipe for disaster. That means if we don't do anything, the bond market is going to do something, which is a lot worse, believe me. And so I hope that our politicians will have the courage and skill to come up with agreements, with policies, with actions that advance the state of California and the nation. Thank you very much. We'll take some questions.